The English Language Paper 1 Section A is based on a fiction text. The tricky thing about this is that it's a fiction extract from the 1800s, so we will cover what that means for language in future slides. The exam board suggests you spend about an hour of the exam on this section. You can clearly see from this slide that the pictures are what we might call old-fashioned now, and that actually sets the tone for Section A in this paper 1. Old-fashioned pictures go hand in hand with much more old-fashioned writing and language. And they'll give you texts from such writers as Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, George Eliot, and so on. In old-fashioned texts, there are quite a lot of differences in language that you need to be aware of. So, for example, they would have used a lot longer words, which today we might be unfamiliar with, or indeed words that have changed meaning over time. Longer sentences are quite characteristic of older texts, where the punctuation was a lot more commas than full stops, exclamation marks, and so on. And sometimes you might come across a slightly different word order. The subject matter as well, given that they were written when the world was very different, is also different from what you'd come across today. There will be 4 questions to answer once you have read the text, each increasingly more difficult. So for question 1, as you can see, it's quite simple and you just get 1 mark. Question 2, 2 marks, and so on. So that at the end of this section you can achieve a potential of 24 marks. The one thing to notice on this slide is that the questions are based on certain lines within the text, and the line numbers will be down the margin on each of the pages. So we've just mentioned that questions are based on certain lines within the text, and a good tip for you when you first look at the paper is to look at which questions relate to which lines and rule it off on the extract all the way across, so that you can clearly see that question 1 is about a certain number of lines, question 2 is about a certain number of lines, and so on. If there are very old-fashioned words or words that the exam board think you may not understand, then they often put it with an asterisk at the very end of the text to define the word and help you there. At the top of the paper you'll see a little bit of background about the extract. That's worth reading because it gives you a little bit of context about what's going on and so on. If step 1 is to rule off on the paper the lines to which the questions are related, step 2 is to quickly read the questions in your answer paper so that when you read the text you're already beginning to formulate ideas of what you might need to put. As you are doing this, as you're reading the text, if you've got a highlighter, then you can highlight anything else that you think might be useful. It may not be what you absolutely rely on, but it will help organize your thoughts and get you thinking about what's being asked of you. And if you look at the questions, there's a quick summary of the type of questions that you may face. So question 1, you literally have to identify a word or phrase which means something specific. Question 2, a little bit more involved. You have to find 2 ways that something is suggested from the language used. And then questions 3 and 4 again increase in difficulty. So question 3, for 6 marks, you might be asked how a character's mood or reactions or feelings are shown, or how atmosphere is created with the language used. And then question 4 often asks you how successfully you think something has been created within the writing. This slide expands just a little bit more on these 4 questions. So if you look carefully at what it says with question 1, you actually only need to write down the word or the phrase, but it is always best to write a sentence if you can, and I'll show you how to do that in subsequent PowerPoints. With question 2, you do need to write a sentence, but it's got to include a quotation and a brief explanation of how something is achieved. Increasingly from that, in question 3, we need quotations and a brief comment or explanation. And if you're going to achieve 6 marks for this, then try to make about 5 or 6 points if you can, and if you've got the time. Question 4 is the biggest weighted mark at 15 marks, and you will be asked to rate how successfully, for example, an atmosphere has been created. It's always better to be positive and say it is successful rather than try and argue that it isn't successful. And again, with this, we need to track through the lines suggested, or indeed the whole passage, and give a statement, a quotation, and a comment or explanation. And if you're working towards achieving 15 marks, then it's best to try and make 12 points if you can.